Welcome to History Teller YT, where we journey deep into the untold stories of peoples, places, and events that shaped our world. Today, we invite you to immerse yourself in the rich and enduring history of the Subanen people, the first inhabitants of the Zamboanga Peninsula. For centuries, the Subanen lived in harmony with the land, nurturing its forests, rivers, and mountains while cultivating a vibrant culture that reflected their resilience, spirituality, and wisdom. Long before outsiders arrived, the Subanen had established thriving communities, a profound connection to the environment, and traditions that bound families and clans together. When migrants from Luzon and Visayas arrived in the early 1900s, the Subanen did not respond with hostility. Instead, they welcomed newcomers with generosity, sharing portions of their ancestral lands so that families could build homes, cultivate crops, and establish livelihoods. This act of generosity, rooted in a deep sense of community and peace, highlights the Subanen spirit, one of inclusion, compassion, and foresight. Yet, despite centuries of openness and contribution, the Subanen have often faced discrimination, marginalization, and invisibility in their own homeland. In this story, we will explore the Subanen journey across generations, from their early settlement and encounters with migrants, through periods of displacement and cultural suppression, to their modern renaissance in the 21st century. You will witness their struggle to reclaim ancestral domains, revive cultural practices like the Bucklog ritual, preserve traditional languages, and implement sustainable environmental practices. We will follow their leadership in regional and national policy, the rise of youth-led movements, the integration of technology in preserving culture, and innovative approaches to climate adaptation and sustainable livelihoods. By the end of this narrative, you will understand how the Subanen, through resilience, knowledge, and unwavering commitment to their heritage, transformed adversity into empowerment, proving that cultural identity and ancestral wisdom can thrive alongside modernity. So, sit back and let History Teller YT guide you through this remarkable story. Listen closely, because this is not just the history of a people. It is a lesson in generosity, perseverance, and the power of respect. The journey we are about to share spans centuries, crossing the fields, rivers, and sacred forests of the Subanen, highlighting moments of struggle, triumph, and continuous resilience. From welcoming strangers to defending their lands, from preserving sacred rituals to embracing modern tools, the Subanen story is a testament to the enduring strength of culture, community, and leadership. Prepare to experience a history that is as alive today as it was hundreds of years ago. And remember, every moment, every lesson, and every act of courage in this story carries wisdom for us all. Long before the Zamboanga Peninsula became a crossroads of cultures, trade, and migration, it was already home to the Subanen. The very name Subanen comes from Suba, meaning river, and Nun, meaning people. We are, at our very core, the people of the river. This is not simply a title, but a deep reflection of our relationship with the land and water that nurtured us for countless generations. The rivers were our highways, our source of food, and our guideposts for life. To live by the river was to live in harmony with nature. And so every bend of the waterway carried our stories, our songs, and our rituals. Our ancestors believed that the land and rivers were sacred gifts entrusted to us by the spirits of creation. They were never owned in the way the settlers later claimed them, but rather stewarded and shared, for the land could not belong to one person alone. In every forest clearing, in every fertile soil, in every fish caught from the streams, there was a prayer of thanks, a recognition that life is sustained by balance and respect. That balance was our strength, and it was what allowed us to thrive for thousands of years before the world outside came pressing in. But while history books often begin the story of Mindanao with the arrival of traders or the coming of the Spanish, we Subanen know that our story starts long before. Our oral traditions tell of ancestors who walked these mountains and valleys before any foreign sail was seen on the horizon. They forged a culture rooted in kinship, respect for elders, and reverence for the unseen world of spirits. For us, every tree has a guardian, every river has a soul, and every mountain echoes with the voices of our ancestors. This worldview shaped not just our spirituality, but also our way of governing ourselves, resolving disputes, and living in unity. To understand the Subanen, you must first understand this. Our history is not written in stone monuments or grand buildings. It is written in the songs sung at night by the river, in the dances that mimic the flight of birds, in the rituals that honor the rice harvest, and in the quiet, steady way we walk the land. We're not a people who sought to conquer or dominate. We are a people who sought to live in peace with what was given to us. This is why, when outsiders eventually came, we did not greet them with hostility. We greeted them with openness, because peace was the foundation of our way of life. When traders and travelers first reached the shores of the Zamboanga Peninsula, the Subanen did not see them as invaders, but as guests. Chinese traders, Muslim missionaries, and even occasional seafarers from neighboring islands crossed our rivers and walked our trails. We welcomed them with humility and curiosity, offering what little we had to share. Our people exchanged woven mats, beads, and food for iron tools, cloth, and salt. Yet, through all these exchanges, the Subanen never surrendered their identity. We absorbed what was useful, but held tightly to the traditions that defined us. The arrival of Islam in Mindanao during the 13th and 14th centuries changed the cultural landscape. The coastal regions became strongholds of new faith and new political systems, led by sultans and datus who wielded influence and control. But the Subanen, living mostly in the highlands and along interior rivers, were not conquered. We respected the new systems, traded with them, and sometimes married into them, but we remained distinct. The rhythm of our lives was still guided by the rivers, the seasons, and the ancestral traditions that bound us together. This independence, however, did not mean isolation. Our people knew of the struggles that came with colonization when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century. From their forts and garrisons in Zamboanga, the Spaniards attempted to spread their power deep into Mindanao, but they found the Subanen difficult to reach. Unlike the coastal peoples, we were not easily subdued because of the remoteness of our communities and the resilience of our culture. Still, the colonial presence would eventually bring changes that rippled into our lives, shaping the destiny of our people in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. The important truth here is that even during these centuries of shifting powers and empires, the Subanen remained a constant. While the world around us changed with the clash of faiths and the ambitions of colonizers, we remained rooted. Our identity was not tied to conquest or domination, but to survival and harmony. We are the quiet witnesses of Mindanao's long history, and yet, too often, history books write us out of the story. But without us, the story of the Zamboanga Peninsula is incomplete. The early 1900s marked a turning point in our history. After the Spanish-American War, the Philippines was handed over to the Americans. And with American colonial policies came migration programs that would forever alter the demographic and cultural balance of Mindanao. People from Luzon and Visayas were encouraged to settle here, to cultivate the land, and to build new lives. For them, it was a promise of opportunity. For us, the Subanen, it was the beginning of a new kind of challenge. Our ancestors did not resist the arrival of these settlers. True to our values, we welcomed them. We allowed them to plant their crops on parts of our ancestral land because we believed in generosity and peace. In our hearts, land was never something to be hoarded. It was to be shared because the earth was abundant and the rivers continued to flow. We saw their hunger and their need, and we chose kindness. But kindness, as history shows, is sometimes mistaken for weakness. Over the years, what was once temporary sharing became permanent occupation. Land titles were granted not to the Subanen, who had lived here since time immemorial, but to the migrants who were new to the land. Slowly, we were pushed further into the uplands, our rivers polluted, our forests cut, and our sacred grounds disturbed. The settlers prospered, building towns and cities, while the Subanen were left to struggle in the margins. What began as an act of peace turned into a long story of dispossession. Yet even as this painful transformation unfolded, we Subanen held onto the values that defined us. We did not turn violent. We did not reject our neighbors. We continued to hope that respect and recognition would come, that our history would not be erased, and that the rivers that carried our songs would still flow freely for the generations to come. Our story, after all, is not just one of loss, it is one of endurance. We are still here, still singing the songs of our ancestors, still holding on to the hope that the world will finally see us not as strangers in our own homeland, but as its original guardians. When the Spaniards set foot in Mindanao in the 16th century, their mission was clear: to expand their empire and spread Christianity. They built forts, such as the famous Real Fuerza de San Jose, later known as Fort Pilar in Zamboanga City. From there, They launched countless expeditions to subdue the people of the peninsula and beyond. But while their galleons commanded the seas and their cannons roared in the coasts, their influence barely reached the mountain valleys where the Subanen thrived. We were not a people of the coasts. We were a people of rivers, forests, and uplands. This made us difficult to conquer and even harder to control. Still, the Spanish presence was felt. Our people often became caught in the crossfire of wars between the Spaniards and the Moro sultanates. Raids, forced labor, and tribute systems trickled into the highlands in waves. Some Subanen were captured and made into servants or slaves. Others were drawn into alliances with coastal leaders who resisted Spanish rule. The Subanen, however, never fully submitted to colonial authority. Our autonomy remained, even though it came at the price of being misunderstood, overlooked, and dismissed as tribal folk outside the grand narrative of empire and resistance. Despite centuries of Spanish attempts, the Subanen identity remained intact. Our rituals continued in the uplands. Our dances, like the bucklog, a grand Thanksgiving ritual still practiced today, remained central to our community. The bucklog was more than a dance. It was a spiritual gathering that united families and honored both the living and the spirits of ancestors. To perform, it was an act of resistance, a way of saying that despite foreign domination in the lowlands, our culture would not be erased. This invisibility to colonial powers became both a shield and a curse. We were not conquered, but neither were we recognized. When history was written by Spaniards, it spoke of their wars with the Moros, their missions to Christianize the natives, and their forts that stood as symbols of power. But in those pages, the Subanen appeared rarely, if at all. To the colonizers, we were silent, peripheral. Yet in truth, we were watching, surviving, and holding fast to the rivers that defined our world. When Spain finally fell in 1898 after losing to the Americans, the Philippines entered a new era under U.S. colonial control. For many, it was another chapter of foreign rule, but for the Subanen, it was the beginning of more direct and lasting transformations. Unlike the Spaniards, the Americans sought not only to control the coastal areas, but to reshape the entire Philippine society under their governance. Through laws, surveys, and resettlement programs, they left marks that would forever change our ancestral lands. The Americans introduced a land titling system based on Western notions of private ownership. For them, land was something to be measured, divided, and registered in official records. But for the Subanen, land was communal, spiritual, and deeply tied to kinship. We did not need titles to prove ownership. Our rivers, forests, and mountains bore witness to our presence for countless generations. Unfortunately, because our ancestors did not have paper titles, much of our land was declared public domain and open for homesteading by migrants from other islands. This legal erasure was devastating. Families who had lived for centuries in specific valleys suddenly found themselves labeled as squatters on their own ancestral grounds. American education, governance, and economic policies further widened the gap. While schools introduced English and Western values to the wider Philippine population, the Subanen were often left behind, considered too remote or uncivilized to prioritize. The seeds of marginalization were planted during this period, not through open warfare, but through bureaucracy, laws, and institutions that failed to recognize us. At the same time, however, the Americans also brought infrastructure that opened up the peninsula. Roads, bridges, and ports made it easier for settlers to arrive in droves. The Subanen, who once shared their land freely, now saw strangers plowing fields, cutting timber, and claiming ownership of spaces we once held sacred. This was not simply migration. It was a structural displacement sanctioned by colonial authority. And yet, in the face of these pressures, the Subanen adapted quietly. We moved deeper into the uplands, kept our traditions alive and secret, and waited for a day when our rights would once again be recognized. The early 1900s, under both American and later Commonwealth governments, saw Mindanao advertised as a land of promise. For settlers from Luzon and Visayas, it was a chance to escape poverty, famine, and landlessness in their home provinces. For the government, it was a strategy to develop Mindanao by encouraging migration into lands deemed and used or underutilized. But in truth, these lands were never empty. They were home to us, the Subanen. When the settlers came, our ancestors extended their hands in welcome. They did not shut the doors of their villages. Instead, they allowed these new neighbors to cultivate portions of ancestral land. believing that kindness and peace would create strong ties. This generosity reflected the Subanen worldview, that the earth provides enough for all if people live in balance. But as years passed, the temporary became permanent. The settlers did not only plant crops, they built homes, claimed titles, and established towns. Slowly, the Subanen found themselves pushed farther into the margins. The pain of this transformation cannot be understated. Imagine living on land where your ancestors are buried, where your rituals are tied to the soil, only to be told by officials that you no longer own it because your name does not appear on a document. Imagine seeing strangers prosper on fields your people once nurtured, while you are told to move uphill to less fertile ground. This is the silent wound of the Subanen story, a wound not always visible, but carried deeply in our hearts. Still, despite this hardship, we did not close ourselves off. Many Subanen intermarried with settlers, shared traditions, and sought peaceful coexistence. Yet discrimination also grew. Our language, clothes, and rituals were mocked as backward. Our identity, instead of being celebrated as part of the peninsula's rich heritage, was treated as inferior. And so, the irony of our generosity is that the very land we shared became the tool of our displacement, and the very kindness we showed became the reason others forgot to respect us. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the Philippines was left battered, scarred, and in desperate need of rebuilding. The Zamboanga Peninsula was no exception. Japanese occupation had disrupted trade, devastated towns, and left communities reeling from violence. For the Subanen, the war was both a distant storm and a painful intrusion. Many of our villages were far from the main battlefields, but the consequences of the war still reached us. Displacement, fear, and new pressures from a government eager to rebuild through modernization. In the years following independence in 1946, the Philippine state identified Mindanao as a key frontier for national development. Manila's leaders envisioned the vast lands of Mindanao as the land of promise, a space where landless Filipinos from the north could find new opportunities. For them, this was nation building. But for the Subanen, it was another chapter in the slow erosion of our ancestral rights. Programs were launched that encouraged waves of settlers to come, often with promises of land titles, tools, and support. Once again, we who had lived here for centuries found ourselves invisible in the eyes of the state. The difference between this era and earlier migrations was the speed and scale. With peace restored after the war, thousands of families from Luzon and Visayas poured into Mindanao. Some were driven by hope. Others were forced by poverty and famine in their home provinces. They came by boat, carrying only what little they had, and settled in areas the government deemed public lands. But these public lands were, in truth, Subanen ancestral domains. Forests where we hunted, rivers where we fished, and fields where we planted were suddenly reclassified and handed over to newcomers with paper titles. The Subanen way of life, communal, spiritual, tied to the rhythms of nature, clashed with this new system. Where once land was shared and respected, it was now surveyed, fenced, and owned. Our ancestors' grave sites were cleared for farms. Sacred groves were cut down for lumber. The very rivers that gave us our name became polluted by mining and logging that followed in the settlers' wake. It was not war that displaced us this time. It was development. And development, unlike war, left scars that were harder to heal because they were written into laws, maps, and policies that erased our existence from the land. By the 1950s and 1960s, the Subanen had begun to feel the full weight of exclusion. Towns and cities in the Zamboanga Peninsula grew quickly as migrants prospered. Schools, roads, and markets expanded, but these were built mostly for the new communities. The Subanen, pushed deeper into the hills, often remained without access to education, health services, or infrastructure. Our children walked hours through difficult terrain just to attend schools where our language was not spoken, and our culture was often dismissed as primitive. The discrimination deepened as society modernized. Subanen traditions, our colorful woven garments, our rituals like bucklog, our musical instruments such as the gong and the bamboo flute, were often mocked by outsiders. To wear our clothes in public was to invite laughter. To speak our language in schools was to be silenced. Slowly, many Subanen children began to feel ashamed of their identity, choosing instead to hide it in order to fit into the settler-dominated society. The wound of invisibility cut deeper. At the same time, economic displacement worsened. Settlers with land titles planted cash crops, corn, coconut, and later rubber. that transformed the land into commercial farms. Logging companies entered with government permits, cutting down forests that were once sacred to us. Mining concessions were granted without our consent, poisoning rivers and destroying the fertile soil. Each time we protested, we were told we had no legal standing because we lacked titles. Each time we resisted, we were painted as obstacles to progress. Yet despite this painful marginalization, the Subanen's spirit endured. Our elders continued to pass down oral traditions, reminding us that our true strength lay not in wealth or land titles, but in our identity as river people. We gathered for rituals in hidden valleys, sang our ancestral songs, and whispered to our children the stories of how our ancestors welcomed the first settlers in peace. These reminders kept us strong, even as the outside world tried to erase us. By the 1970s, the situation in Mindanao grew more complicated. Social unrest spread across the island as conflicts erupted between the government, Muslim groups, and other movements. For the Subanen, caught between these larger forces, the struggle was not about political ideologies, but about survival and recognition. Our cry was simple: respect us as the first people of this land. Government programs that claimed to uplift cultural minorities often fell short. While policies were announced in Manila, they rarely reached our mountain villages. Instead, the exploitation of our resources continued, often with the complicity of powerful outsiders. Mining expanded, logging intensified, and settlers kept arriving. The Subanen were painted as poor, backward, and powerless, a stereotype that ignored the deep wisdom of our culture and the sacrifices we had made to maintain peace in our homeland. But during this era, something also began to shift. Young Subanen leaders started to rise, inspired by both the teachings of our elders and the opportunities of education. Some managed to finish schooling despite discrimination and used their voices to call for justice. They reminded the government and the settlers that the Subanen were not guests in this land. We were its original guardians. They spoke of our bucklog rituals, of our rivers, of our ancestral territories that stretched far beyond the uplands where we had been pushed. Slowly, the world began to hear that the Subanen were still here, still fighting, still demanding recognition. The cry for recognition was not about pity. We never asked to be pitied. What we asked for was respect, the same respect our ancestors gave when they opened their doors to strangers. Respect meant acknowledging that we were not relics of the past, but living communities with rights, cultures, and identities. Respect meant protecting our lands, honoring our rituals, and including us in the future of the Zamboanga Peninsula. Without that respect, peace would always be fragile, because peace built on exclusion is not true peace at all. In 1972, President Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law across the Philippines. For much of the nation, it meant curfews, censorship, and the suspension of democratic freedoms. But for the Subanen in the Zamboanga Peninsula, martial law carried a different weight. It was the time when the forests groaned under chainsaws, the rivers bled with silt, and our voices were silenced under the pretext of national development. The Marcos government pushed ambitious programs to exploit the natural wealth of Mindanao. Logging concessions were handed out to powerful families and corporations, many of them with close ties to those in power. The Subanen ancestral forests, rich in hardwood like Nara, Lawan, and Molavi, became prime targets. What had once been sacred groves, guarded by rituals and respect, were reduced to commercial resources measured only in profit. The sound of the bucklog ritual, once echoing across valleys, was now drowned out by the roar of bulldozers and trucks carrying felled timber to ports. For the Subanen, this was more than an environmental crisis. It was a spiritual violation. Our elders taught us that every tree has a guardian spirit. To cut one without ritual was to invite misfortune. But under martial law, there was no space for these beliefs. Soldiers often escorted logging crews, silencing communities that dared to resist. To speak against the destruction of forests was to risk being branded a rebel or a sympathizer of insurgents. Many Subanen lived in fear, not only of losing their land, but also of losing their lives if they stood in the way of development. This era also intensified displacement. As lowland settlers expanded farms into newly cleared areas, the Subanen were forced deeper into marginal lands, far from the fertile valleys where they once thrived. Hunger grew as traditional food sources like wild game and river fish dwindled due to deforestation. Our children became malnourished, our elders despaired, and yet our culture struggled to survive in secrecy. In this way, martial law was not just about dictatorship in Manila. It was about the silencing of the Subanen identity hidden beneath the weight of chainsaws and guns. The 1970s and 1980s marked the peak of what some called the golden age of resource extraction in the Zamboanga Peninsula. But for the Subanen, it was an age of loss. Logging companies cleared vast tracts of rainforest, exporting millions of cubic meters of timber to Japan, the United States, and Europe. The wealth generated never returned to our villages. Instead, it enriched corporations and politicians while leaving our land scarred with erosion and barren slopes. Rivers that once flowed clear became clogged with silt, destroying fish habitats and making water unsafe to drink. But logging was only the beginning. Mining followed soon after, targeting the rich mineral deposits beneath Subanen ancestral lands. Gold, copper, and other resources drew companies with promises of jobs and progress. Yet the reality was devastation. Open-pit mines scarred the landscape. Chemicals poisoned the rivers, and sacred mountains were blasted apart for ore. Our communities, excluded from decision-making, watched helplessly as the ground beneath their feet was sold off to outsiders. The government justified these projects as part of national development, claiming they would modernize the countryside. But for the Subanen, they meant more displacement, more hunger, and more marginalization. Promises of jobs rarely reached us. If they did, they were low-paying, dangerous, and temporary. Instead of prosperity, we received polluted lands and fractured communities. Our rituals, which depended on the health of forests and rivers, became harder to perform as the natural balance was destroyed. Resistance did exist. Brave Subanen leaders raised their voices, calling for the protection of ancestral domains and the recognition of indigenous rights. But during martial law, such resistance was risky. Many who spoke out faced harassment, arrest, or worse. Still, the seeds of resistance were planted. Our people began to realize that silence would only mean further erasure, and that to survive as Subanen, we would need to defend not only our culture, but also our land with renewed determination. Despite the harsh realities of martial law, the Subanen spirit did not die. Our communities adapted, finding ways to preserve culture even under oppression. Elders gathered children at night to tell stories by firelight, passing on myths and oral histories so they would not be forgotten. Women wove traditional garments in secret, wearing them during rituals away from the gaze of outsiders. Music, too, became a refuge. The sound of the agong and the bamboo flute carried not only melody, but also resistance, reminding us that our identity could not be fully silenced. The bucklog ritual, though threatened, continued in hidden valleys and mountain clearings. In these ceremonies, we celebrated life, gave thanks to the spirits, and strengthened the bonds of kinship. Each dance step, each beat of the drum, was an act of defiance against a world that wanted us erased. For the Subanen, survival was not only physical, but cultural. Even as land was taken, even as forests were cut, we clung to the rituals that defined us, because to lose them would mean losing ourselves. It was during this time that younger generations began to see the importance of reclaiming pride in being Subanen. Some who managed to study outside returned with new ideas, blending modern knowledge with ancestral wisdom. They spoke of indigenous rights, of environmental protection, and of the need to unite as one people across the peninsula. While martial law sought to divide and silence, it also inadvertently sparked a growing awareness that the Subanen must stand together if they were to survive the storms of modernity. By the time martial law was lifted in 1981, the Subanen had already endured decades of displacement and discrimination. Our lands were scarred, our voices often silenced, and our rights ignored. Yet we remained. The resilience of our culture, passed down through songs, rituals, and the enduring spirit of peace, ensured that the Subanen story did not end. Instead, it prepared us for the next chapter, one where the fight for recognition and justice would become louder, stronger, and impossible to ignore. The fall of martial law in 1986 marked a new chapter in Philippine history. For the nation, it was a time of renewed hope, democracy, and the promise of reforms. But for the Subanen, the years that followed were both a challenge and an opportunity. Our lands were still threatened by commercial exploitation, logging, and mining. Our culture had been marginalized for decades, and our communities were scattered, many forced uphill into marginal lands. Yet for the first time in a long time, there was a legal framework and a political space where indigenous voices could begin to be heard. During the presidency of Corazon Aquino, several policies were introduced that aimed to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples. While these policies were imperfect and often poorly implemented, they opened doors that had long been closed to the Subanen. For example, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, which would be passed later in 1997, had its roots in this period. It promised ancestral domain recognition, cultural preservation, and the right of indigenous communities to manage their lands according to their traditions. For the Subanen, this legal recognition was a powerful tool, yet it required organization, courage, and persistence to claim what was rightfully ours. The Subanen communities began organizing themselves into councils and associations, uniting leaders, elders, and youth. Meetings were held in riverside villages under the shade of sacred trees, where elders told the younger generation about the history of the land, the kindness shown to settlers, and the sacrifices made to preserve culture. These gatherings were not only strategic but spiritual. They reminded us that ancestral domain was not simply a legal concept. It was our identity, our history, and the very foundation of our survival. We were determined that the mistakes of the past, being sidelined, being treated as invisible, would not be repeated. At the same time, education became a crucial focus. Subanen leaders encouraged the youth to finish school and study law, governance, and environmental science, equipping them with knowledge to defend their lands. Many young Subanen also traveled to nearby towns and cities, learning to navigate bureaucracies and advocate in government offices. This period marked a shift. No longer were we silently enduring. We were organizing, learning, and preparing to assert our rights, all while keeping our cultural traditions alive. One of the most significant struggles of the Subanen during the post-martial law period was the fight to claim legal recognition for ancestral domain. Under the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997, indigenous communities were given the right to formally delineate and claim the lands they had inhabited for generations. This was a monumental opportunity, yet it was also a daunting task. It required mapping territories, providing historical evidence, and confronting both local and corporate interests that had long exploited the land. For decades, outsiders, settlers, logging companies, and mining corporations had benefited from the Subanen's generosity and the lack of formal titles. Now, asserting our rights meant challenging entrenched power structures. Families gathered oral histories, recorded sacred sites, and documented the rivers, forests, and mountains that were central to our communities. Each story, each piece of evidence, became a weapon in the fight for recognition. It was a labor of love, but also a necessity. Without it, the Subanen risked losing more land, more resources, and more of our cultural identity. This struggle also highlighted the resilience and unity of the Subanen people. Villages that had once been isolated began to connect through networks of leaders and elders. Women played a critical role in these movements, preserving knowledge about plants, rituals, and sacred sites while also advocating for legal recognition. Young people acted as bridges between the elders and government institutions, translating ancestral wisdom into formal presentations, maps, and legal documents. For the first time, we were combining our spiritual and cultural knowledge with modern tools of advocacy, showing the world that we were not relics of the past, but active participants in shaping the future of our land. The fight was not without setbacks. Some local authorities resisted, claiming that the Subanen had no formal proof of ownership. Companies contested the ancestral domain claims, threatening legal battles that could drag on for years. But the Subanen refused to back down. Our elders reminded us that patience and persistence were our allies. We had endured centuries of migration, displacement, and marginalization. The recognition of ancestral domain was not just a legal victory. It was a reclamation of identity, a validation of generations of struggle, and a reaffirmation that the Subanen people had always been the rightful guardians of this land. While the fight for land rights was crucial, the Subanen also understood that culture could not survive if it was not actively preserved. Post-martial law, we faced a dual challenge: protecting our territory and maintaining our traditions. Schools introduced modern curricula, and media flooded the villages with influences that threatened to dilute our identity. Subanen songs, rituals, and oral histories risked being forgotten if they were not actively transmitted to younger generations. Elders took the initiative to organize cultural festivals, workshops, and educational programs within the community. The Bucklog ritual, in particular, gained renewed significance. It was no longer only a spiritual celebration. It became a statement of identity, a public assertion that the Subanen were alive, present, and proud of their heritage. Children learned to play the agong, to dance traditional steps, and to recite ancestral stories. This cultural transmission became an act of resistance against the erasure we had endured for decades. At the same time, alliances with NGOs and advocacy groups helped bring Subanen culture and rights to national attention. Researchers and journalists documented our traditions, providing a bridge between ancestral knowledge and modern awareness campaigns. Through conferences, workshops, and media, the Subanen message was spreading. We are the first people of the Zamboanga Peninsula. Our contributions are invaluable. Our lands are sacred, and we deserve respect. This period set the foundation for a new era of Subanen identity, one that combined resilience, cultural pride, and legal advocacy. By the end of the 1990s, the Subanen were no longer invisible. We had reclaimed our voice, asserted our ancestral rights, and preserved our traditions in a rapidly changing world. The struggles of the past had shaped a new generation, strong, knowledgeable, and determined to protect what was theirs. It was clear that the story of the Subanen was far from over. In fact, it was entering a chapter that promised justice, recognition, and the celebration of a culture that had survived against the odds. As the Philippines entered the 21st century, the Zamboanga Peninsula continued to develop rapidly. Roads were paved, towns expanded, and economic activity increased. Yet for the Subanen, the promises of modernization often came with renewed threats. Decades of migration had already displaced many families from their ancestral lowlands. Now, new waves of settlers, commercial farms, and development projects threatened to deepen these historical inequities. The legal recognition of ancestral domain provided hope, but it did not automatically protect our lands from encroachment. Many Subanen communities faced disputes with logging companies, agribusiness investors, and mining corporations, all eager to exploit natural resources. Rivers we had fished for generations were now polluted. Forests that had once sustained our food, medicine, and culture were depleted. Settlers sometimes resisted Subanen claims, arguing that the newcomers had developed lands that had long been ours. These conflicts were not only legal, but emotional, striking at the heart of identity, memory, and the connection to our homeland. Despite these challenges, the Subanen persisted. Local councils and elders worked tirelessly to map ancestral territories, collect oral histories, and organize communities to assert their rights. Schools were established within villages to educate Subanen children about their culture, language, and history. Young Subanen were encouraged to pursue higher education, law, and environmental science, equipping themselves to advocate for their people in modern institutions. This combination of traditional knowledge and modern education became a powerful tool for survival and advocacy, ensuring that our voices were heard in a world that often ignored us. The 2000s also brought heightened environmental challenges to Subanen territories. Climate change intensified typhoons, floods, and droughts, disproportionately affecting upland communities. Deforestation from both legal and illegal logging disrupted ecosystems, while mining operations introduced heavy metals and chemicals into rivers. These changes threatened not only our food sources, but also the spiritual and cultural foundations of our communities. Waterways, forests, and mountains, which had long been considered sacred, became battlegrounds between survival and exploitation. Yet even in the face of environmental devastation, the Subanen showed resilience. Communities implemented traditional conservation practices, teaching younger generations how to manage rivers sustainably, plant native trees, and respect sacred sites. Elders conducted rituals to honor the land, asking the spirits for guidance and protection. These practices were not merely symbolic. They reinforced communal cohesion and strengthened the cultural identity that corporate and governmental forces often sought to undermine. Advocacy groups, both local and international, partnered with Subanen communities to raise awareness of environmental threats and land rights violations. Workshops, training sessions, and legal seminars empowered Subanen leaders to file claims, attend hearings, and negotiate with government agencies. Despite systemic barriers, these efforts allowed the Subanen to assert their right to be stewards of their ancestral domains. This period emphasized that cultural survival and environmental protection were inseparable. The preservation of one ensured the preservation of the other. In addition to legal and environmental challenges, the Subanen in the 2000s began to engage in broader advocacy efforts. Social media, documentaries and cultural festivals became platforms to educate outsiders about our history, struggles, and contributions to the Zamboanga Peninsula. We highlighted not only our displacement, but also our generosity, resilience, and the centuries of peaceful coexistence with settlers. These campaigns sought to change public perception, countering stereotypes that painted Subanen culture as backward or irrelevant. The fight was both local and global. National conferences on Indigenous rights provided spaces for Subanen representatives to share experiences and strategies with other Indigenous groups across the Philippines. International forums on environmental protection and cultural preservation offered opportunities to highlight the intersection of land rights and sustainable development. Our stories, once invisible in textbooks and ignored by policymakers, were now being documented, shared, and celebrated. Even as challenges persisted, these advocacy efforts began to yield tangible results. Some ancestral domains were formally recognized. Environmental regulations slowed certain destructive projects, and awareness campaigns encouraged younger generations to embrace their identity with pride. The Subanen story in this period is one of transformation, from communities threatened by marginalization to organized, informed, and resilient advocates of their culture and lands. Through legal action, education, and cultural revival, we prove that the Subanen are not merely remnants of history. They are active participants shaping the future of their homeland. The 2010s marked a transformative period for the Subanen youth. For decades, our communities had endured marginalization, displacement, and discrimination. Elders had passed down knowledge through oral traditions, but globalization, modern technology, and the pervasive influence of mainstream Philippine culture posed both challenges and opportunities. Young Subanen were caught between two worlds: the ancestral ways of their forebears and the promises of modern education and technology. This tension, however, became a catalyst for activism and renewed engagement with our cultural identity. Youth organizations began to emerge across Subanen communities. High school and college students who had experienced the disadvantages of limited infrastructure, poor access to education, and environmental degradation started forming networks to advocate for both their ancestral lands and cultural preservation. They were determined not to let the struggles of previous generations be forgotten. These young leaders often acted as bridges, translating the wisdom of elders into actionable strategies, petitions, and projects that could interact with modern legal, governmental, and non-governmental systems. At the heart of this movement was a deep understanding that education and cultural preservation were inseparable. Many young Subanen pursued formal schooling in nearby towns or cities, studying law, environmental science, and community development, while simultaneously learning traditional rituals, songs, and agricultural practices from their elders. This dual approach allowed them to articulate their rights in both modern legal language and cultural narratives, giving them a unique advantage in negotiations with local authorities, corporations, and advocacy groups. For the first time, the Subanen youth became visible as agents of change, uniting generations around a shared vision of cultural resilience, environmental stewardship, and legal recognition. The integration of modern education with cultural knowledge became a cornerstone of Subanen strategy in the 2010s. Many villages established community schools where children could learn standard subjects like mathematics, science, and history alongside Subanen language, folklore, and rituals. Teachers, often Subanen themselves, emphasized the importance of identity and heritage, helping students understand that their knowledge of rivers, forests, and ancestral customs was just as valuable as any classroom lesson. Higher education became a critical tool for advocacy. Subanen youth who earned college degrees brought back expertise in environmental law, sustainable agriculture, and policy analysis. They could now map ancestral domains with precision, document sacred sites, and challenge illegal logging or mining operations using legal frameworks. These educated young leaders worked in tandem with elders to ensure that cultural practices, such as the bucklog ritual, remained central to community life. Education did not replace tradition. It strengthened it, creating a generation capable of defending both land and culture in increasingly complex modern contexts. Moreover, technology played a role in amplifying Subanen voices. Social media platforms, online petitions, and video documentaries allowed communities to share their struggles and successes with the wider world. Festivals and cultural exhibitions were recorded and streamed, raising awareness nationally and internationally. The Subanen story once invisible in textbooks and news reports, began reaching broader audiences, emphasizing both our historical generosity in sharing lands and the injustices we had endured. Through these efforts, the youth proved that embracing modern education did not mean abandoning tradition. Instead, it was a powerful tool for survival, advocacy, and pride in Subanen heritage. Despite progress in education, advocacy, and cultural revival, the 2010s were marked by continued land disputes and environmental challenges. Subanen ancestral lands remained under threat from agricultural expansion, commercial plantations, logging operations, and mining activities. Legal battles, often drawn out and expensive, tested the resilience of communities. Many young leaders and elders found themselves attending hearings, negotiating with government agencies, and defending maps, ancestral domain claims, and sacred sites against developers who prioritize profit over heritage. These struggles were not only legal, but deeply personal. For the Subanen, land is tied to identity, ancestry, and spirituality. Losing a forest or river was not merely a material loss. It was a disruption of cultural continuity and a severing of connection to ancestors. Communities responded by strengthening internal cohesion. Villages held collective rituals, documented oral histories, and organized cultural festivals that reinforced solidarity. The bucklog, once a ritual of thanksgiving, became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that despite centuries of marginalization, the Subanen were not defeated. Partnerships with NGOs, environmental advocates, and international indigenous rights organizations became crucial during this period. These collaborations helped amplify Subanen concerns, provided resources for legal challenges, and offered platforms to advocate for policy changes. By combining traditional knowledge, modern education, and strategic alliances, the Subanen managed to reclaim parts of their ancestral domains, protect sacred forests, and raise awareness of ongoing injustices. The 2010s, though fraught with challenges, showcased the resilience of the Subanen people and the growing role of youth as defenders of both land and culture, ensuring that the story of our ancestors continued into the modern era. In the 2010s, the Subanen people began to witness a remarkable resurgence of cultural pride. After decades of marginalization, displacement, and cultural suppression, communities sought to reclaim and celebrate the rich traditions that define their identity. The bucklog ritual, once hidden from outsiders due to fear of ridicule or exploitation, became a focal point of this revival. Villages organized public performances to celebrate their heritage, inviting neighboring communities and even researchers to observe the ceremonies. The rhythm of the agong, the beating of bamboo drums, and the songs of ancestors echoed through valleys that had long been silenced by industrial encroachment. This revival extended beyond rituals. The Subanen language, once at risk of being forgotten due to schooling in Filipino or English, gained renewed attention. Community schools implemented bilingual programs, teaching children not only mainstream subjects, but also the native Subanen tongue, oral histories, and storytelling traditions. Songs, folk tales, and proverbs were recorded and transcribed, ensuring that even dispersed families could access their heritage. Traditional weaving, beadwork, and farming techniques were also revitalized. Women played a pivotal role in this cultural renaissance, passing down skills and knowledge while advocating for the recognition of their contributions within the broader society. The revival of culture also became a form of empowerment. For many Subanen youth, participating in rituals, festivals, and educational programs created a strong sense of identity and purpose. It reminded them that their ancestors had survived colonialism, displacement, and discrimination, and that the responsibility to protect the land and culture now rested in their hands. By reconnecting with their heritage, communities strengthened social cohesion and resilience, ensuring that the Subanen voice would continue to be heard in the modern era. Alongside cultural revival, the Subanen intensified environmental advocacy. By the 2010s and early 2020s, the consequences of decades of logging, mining, and agricultural expansion were unmistakable. Rivers polluted with silt and chemicals, forests decimated, and biodiversity diminished. Subanen leaders recognized that environmental protection was inseparable from cultural survival. Sacred rivers, mountain groves, and wetlands were not only vital for livelihoods, but were also spiritual spaces tied to ancestral practices. Communities organized campaigns to protect these areas, using both traditional knowledge and modern scientific methods. Mapping projects documented sacred sites, forest cover, and water sources, creating detailed records that could be presented to government agencies, courts, and environmental organizations. Youth activists often use drones, GPS technology, and digital media to document encroachment and environmental degradation, turning local struggles into national and international awareness campaigns. Subanen leaders collaborated with NGOs, universities, and indigenous rights groups to secure legal protections and prevent illegal exploitation of ancestral lands. These environmental campaigns also emphasize sustainable development. The Subanen promoted agroforestry, ecotourism, and community-based forest management, demonstrating that economic activity could coexist with cultural and environmental stewardship. By integrating ancestral knowledge with modern environmental science, the Subanen showcased a model for resilience and sustainability. These efforts gradually gained recognition from local governments, the national media, and international organizations, signaling that the Subanen were not just survivors of history, but proactive guardians of their land and culture. The sustained efforts of the Subanen in cultural revival, environmental advocacy, and legal mobilization began to bear fruit in the 2010s and 2020s. Several ancestral domains were officially recognized by the Philippine government under the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA. These legal victories were monumental, granting communities control over territories they had inhabited for centuries. Recognition empowered the Subanen to manage forests, rivers, and sacred sites according to traditional practices while engaging with modern governance structures. National recognition also brought broader awareness of Subanen contributions to the Zamboanga Peninsula. Public campaigns highlighted the centuries of generosity extended to settlers and migrants, correcting historical narratives that had often overlooked or misrepresented Subanen history. Documentaries, articles, and cultural exhibitions showcased our rituals, art, and resilience, fostering pride within the community and respect among outsiders. The Subanen were no longer invisible. They were now recognized as crucial custodians of both cultural heritage and environmental stewardship in the region. Despite these achievements, challenges remained. Land disputes, illegal logging, and encroachment continued in some areas, requiring vigilance and ongoing advocacy. Yet the Subanen had demonstrated a remarkable ability to blend tradition with modern strategy, education with activism, and spirituality with legal frameworks. By the end of this period, the Subanen had transformed adversity into empowerment, showing the world that their story was one of survival, pride, and proactive engagement in shaping the present and future of the Zamboanga Peninsula. By the 2020s, the Subanen had increasingly recognized the importance of political engagement to safeguard their lands, rights, and culture. Decades of marginalization, combined with ongoing environmental threats and land disputes, demonstrated that cultural preservation alone could not ensure survival. Subanen leaders began actively participating in local and regional governance, seeking positions in barangay councils, municipal governments, and indigenous peoples' advisory bodies. This allowed the Subanen to influence policy decisions directly, advocate for ancestral domain protection, and ensure that development projects did not violate indigenous rights. Political engagement was not limited to seeking office. It also included participation in consultations, hearings, and legislative processes. Subanen representatives presented maps, oral histories, and documentation of sacred sites to government agencies, emphasizing both the cultural and ecological significance of their territories. Through these actions, the Subanen asserted that they were not passive recipients of policy, but active stakeholders capable of shaping development in their homeland. Their participation challenged long-standing stereotypes that indigenous communities were backward or invisible, showing that Subanen knowledge, governance structures, and values could inform modern political decision-making. This era also marked the strategic use of alliances. Subanen leaders built coalitions with other indigenous groups, human rights organizations, and environmental advocates to amplify their voice at the regional and national level. These networks strengthened advocacy efforts, enabling the Subanen to challenge both corporate exploitation and local corruption more effectively. The political awakening of the Subanen in the 2020s demonstrated that empowerment was multidimensional. It combined cultural pride, legal strategy, and active participation in governance to defend both land and identity. Alongside political engagement, the Subanen actively collaborated with non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and international advocacy groups. These partnerships provided technical assistance, legal expertise, and platforms to raise awareness about ongoing challenges. NGOs help communities map ancestral domains using GPS technology, document environmental degradation, and produce reports suitable for legal and policy advocacy. This enabled the Subanen to bring credible evidence to courts, government hearings, and international forums, strengthening their claims and increasing accountability. International advocacy also became an essential dimension. Subanen representatives participated in global Indigenous rights conferences, sharing their experiences and learning strategies from other communities facing similar challenges. These engagements elevated the Subanen story beyond the Philippines, emphasizing universal issues such as land rights, environmental protection, and cultural survival. By combining local knowledge with international exposure, the Subanen were able to secure attention, support, and pressure from external actors who could influence domestic policy. Importantly, partnerships extended beyond formal institutions. Local NGOs facilitated workshops for youth, women, and elders, focusing on leadership, legal literacy, and environmental stewardship. These programs strengthened intergenerational knowledge transfer, ensuring that Subanen culture remained vibrant even as communities became more politically active. By integrating traditional wisdom with modern advocacy techniques, the Subanen demonstrated that sustainable activism required both cultural grounding and strategic alliances, enabling them to protect ancestral lands while promoting environmental and social justice. The 2020s also witnessed a surge in Subanen youth-led initiatives. Young people, inspired by both their elders and the successes of previous generations, took leadership roles in education, advocacy, and cultural preservation. They leveraged social media to document rituals, organize campaigns, and raise awareness about land disputes. Platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube allowed the youth to reach audiences far beyond their villages, challenging narratives that had long ignored or misrepresented Subanen history. Youth movements combined creativity with activism. Students organized eco-cultural festivals, digital storytelling projects, and community-based environmental programs, integrating traditional knowledge with contemporary methods. These initiatives served multiple purposes. They revitalized culture, educated peers, strengthened communal bonds, and provided evidence of sustainable land stewardship. The involvement of youth also ensured that advocacy efforts were not limited to older leaders, but became a multi-generational endeavor capable of long-term continuity. Crucially, youth-led movements emphasized empowerment rather than pity. The Subanen youth insisted on being recognized as active agents of change, capable of negotiating with governments, corporations, and NGOs. By asserting their rights and showcasing their skills, they challenged stereotypes of indigenous communities as passive or dependent. This period solidified a new vision for the Subanen, a community that preserved its traditions, engaged with modern governance, and trained younger generations to continue defending both culture and land. The 2020s, therefore, became a decade not only of survival, but of proactive transformation, ensuring that Subanen identity remained strong, visible, and respected. By the 2020s, the Subanen had solidified their role as environmental leaders in the Zamboanga Peninsula. Decades of exploitation, deforestation, and mining had taught communities the consequences of unchecked development, and the lessons were now applied in proactive ways. Subanen leaders began implementing community-driven programs for forest regeneration, watershed protection, and sustainable agriculture. Traditional knowledge, passed down through generations, became a cornerstone of these initiatives, demonstrating that ancestral wisdom was not outdated, but essential to modern environmental management. Elders guided younger generations in identifying and preserving sacred forests, medicinal plants, and wildlife habitats. Rituals such as the bucklog were not only cultural events, but also educational tools, teaching younger Subanen about ecological cycles, the interdependence of species, and the spiritual significance of natural resources. Youth leaders integrated these teachings with contemporary science, using GPS mapping, soil analysis, and biodiversity monitoring to document and protect the land. These efforts strengthened the community's ability to defend their territories while showcasing sustainable practices to outsiders, including local governments, NGOs, and academic institutions. Leadership in environmental matters also extended to advocacy. Subanen representatives engaged with policymakers, providing evidence of environmental degradation and proposing community-based solutions. This proactive approach contrasted sharply with past experiences, where the Subanen were marginalized in decision-making processes. Now, their knowledge and leadership were recognized as indispensable in balancing development and environmental protection, positioning the Subanen as both custodians of culture and pioneers of sustainable practices in the region. The combined efforts in legal advocacy, cultural revival, and environmental stewardship began to yield tangible victories in the 2020s. Several ancestral domains received formal recognition under the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, granting communities legal authority over vast stretches of forests, rivers, and agricultural lands. These victories were more than symbolic. They enabled the Subanen to actively manage resources, prevent illegal logging, and regulate mining and agricultural activities within their territories. Environmental recognition also came from partnerships with NGOs and government agencies. Collaborative projects in reforestation, ecotourism, and community agriculture demonstrated that sustainable development could coexist with ancestral practices. Subanen communities received funding and technical assistance to plant native trees, restore riverbanks, and maintain biodiversity, linking ecological health to cultural survival. The recognition extended beyond national borders as Subanen communities were invited to international forums on indigenous environmental management, highlighting their role as leaders in combining traditional wisdom with contemporary solutions. These victories were hard-earned. They required meticulous documentation, negotiations, and persistence in the face of powerful economic interests. Legal claims had to be substantiated with maps, oral histories, and environmental data. Protests, petitions, and public awareness campaigns complemented formal legal strategies. Through these combined efforts, the Subanen demonstrated resilience and strategic acumen, proving that cultural preservation, environmental protection, and legal advocacy could coexist effectively, offering a model for other indigenous communities facing similar challenges. Perhaps the most remarkable achievement of the Subanen in this period was the integration of culture with modern, sustainable development practices. Subanen traditions, such as sacred rituals, communal farming, and ecological taboos, were aligned with environmental and economic strategies. Agroforestry projects, for example, combined commercial crops with native trees, ensuring both income and forest regeneration. Rivers and wetlands were protected not only for practical reasons, but also for their spiritual significance, linking economic incentives with cultural values. Educational initiatives reinforced this integration. Schools incorporated traditional ecological knowledge alongside formal science education, teaching children that ancestral wisdom was compatible with modern innovation. Community workshops trained youth in sustainable agriculture, water management, and renewable energy, blending technical skills with cultural teachings. Festivals and rituals continued to celebrate both spiritual and environmental connections, emphasizing that protecting the land was synonymous with preserving identity. By the end of this decade, the Subanen had demonstrated a holistic model of sustainable development, one that respected culture, honored ancestors, empowered youth, and engaged with modern governance. Their experience showed that indigenous knowledge could inform contemporary solutions, providing a blueprint for resilience in the face of ongoing environmental and social challenges. The Subanen were not only surviving, they were leading, teaching, and shaping the future of the Zamboanga Peninsula while ensuring that their heritage remained vibrant and respected. One of the most critical aspects of preserving Subanen identity in the 2020s has been the deliberate effort to ensure that intergenerational knowledge is actively passed down. Elders, who hold centuries of oral histories, traditional ecological knowledge, rituals, and farming techniques, have increasingly taken proactive steps to educate the youth. Storytelling sessions, often conducted during community gatherings, festivals, or in the evening around riverbanks and sacred groves, serve not only as cultural preservation tools, but also as educational platforms. Young Subanen learn about ancestral laws, spiritual practices, medicinal plant use, and rituals such as the bucklog, ensuring continuity of knowledge. In addition, elders mentor youth in community leadership, teaching negotiation skills, advocacy strategies, and dispute resolution that have been practiced informally for generations. This combination of cultural and practical knowledge equips the younger generation to navigate modern challenges while remaining rooted in Subanen identity. Youth leaders are encouraged to document stories, map sacred sites, and record oral histories in digital formats to prevent loss of knowledge and make it accessible for future generations. This intentional approach to knowledge transfer has strengthened community cohesion and fostered a sense of responsibility among the youth to continue protecting their heritage. Educational initiatives have also bridged traditional and formal learning. Community schools integrate environmental science with ancestral knowledge, ensuring that students understand both modern ecological principles and indigenous practices. For example, lessons about watershed management are enriched by ancestral stories, explaining the spiritual significance of rivers and forests. This holistic approach ensures that the Subanen remain culturally grounded while equipped to engage with contemporary environmental, legal, and economic challenges. Another transformative strategy adopted by the Subanen in recent years is eco-cultural tourism. By inviting outsiders to observe and participate in rituals, learn traditional crafts, and engage with local farming practices, communities are able to generate sustainable income while educating visitors about their heritage. Festivals centered on the bucklog, traditional dances, and storytelling sessions serve as both cultural showcases and sources of revenue that reinforce the value of tradition. Eco-cultural tourism also creates incentives for conservation. Sacred forests, rivers, and agricultural lands are preserved not only for spiritual and subsistence purposes, but also as attractions that educate visitors about sustainable living and indigenous practices. Youth leaders and trained guides conduct tours that combine ecological lessons with cultural storytelling, emphasizing the interconnectedness of land, culture, and livelihood. Local crafts, textiles, and food products are sold as part of these initiatives, ensuring that economic benefits remain within the community. This approach addresses multiple challenges at once. It strengthens cultural pride, provides economic resilience, and raises awareness of Subanen land rights and environmental issues. By demonstrating that indigenous knowledge and traditions can coexist with sustainable economic activity, the Subanen provide a model for responsible development that respects both people and nature. Furthermore, eco-cultural tourism enhances the visibility of the Subanen in national and international discourse, ensuring that our stories, struggles, and successes are shared widely, countering historical narratives of invisibility and marginalization. Despite these achievements, the Subanen remain vigilant about ongoing and future challenges. Climate change, population pressures, and potential encroachment by commercial interests continue to threaten ancestral domains. Recognizing this, communities are proactively planning for resilience. Disaster preparedness programs, sustainable agriculture training, and reforestation projects are integrated into educational curricula and community initiatives. These measures ensure that youth are prepared to respond to environmental, social, and economic challenges while maintaining cultural continuity. Subanen leaders also emphasize the importance of advocacy skills and political engagement. Youth are encouraged to participate in governance, policy discussions, and legal processes to secure protections for their lands and resources. By combining cultural education, environmental stewardship, and political empowerment, the community prepares the next generation for multifaceted leadership. Elder guidance, paired with modern tools such as digital mapping, social media campaigns, and scientific monitoring, creates a robust framework for both preserving heritage and engaging effectively with the modern world. Looking forward, the Subanen envision a future where cultural identity, environmental responsibility, and sustainable development are inseparable. They aim to continue forging alliances with other indigenous groups, NGOs, government bodies, and educational institutions, ensuring that ancestral knowledge informs contemporary strategies for survival and prosperity. This foresight demonstrates that the Subanen are not merely preserving their past. They're actively shaping a future that honors their ancestors, protects the land, and empowers future generations. By the mid-2020s, the Subanen had established themselves as key players in regional environmental policy across the Zamboanga Peninsula. Decades of ancestral stewardship, combined with modern advocacy and education, position the Subanen as respected authorities on sustainable land management, forest conservation, and water resource protection. Local and regional government bodies increasingly consulted Subanen leaders when drafting policies related to land use, environmental protection, and development projects. This was a remarkable shift from previous decades, when the Subanen had been largely excluded from decision-making processes. The Subanen contribution to regional environmental governance is rooted in centuries of knowledge. Communities maintain sacred forests, protect river ecosystems, and manage agricultural lands using techniques that are both sustainable and culturally significant. By integrating traditional ecological practices with scientific methods, Subanen leaders demonstrate a model of governance that balances environmental protection with community development. Their strategies include mapping ancestral domains using GPS, implementing community-based reforestation programs, and monitoring biodiversity through both modern tools and indigenous observation techniques. These efforts have had tangible impacts. Certain regions previously threatened by illegal logging and mining have seen significant restoration, while sustainable agriculture practices reduce soil erosion and promote biodiversity. Local authorities often turn to Subanen experts for guidance, recognizing that these practices are not merely cultural relics, but practical, proven strategies for ecological preservation. Through leadership in policy and community initiatives, the Subanen showcased that indigenous knowledge is not static, but an essential component of contemporary environmental governance. Alongside regional influence, the Subanen achieved growing recognition at the national level. Efforts to secure ancestral domain titles, promote cultural preservation, and engage in environmental advocacy culminated in formal acknowledgement by government agencies, policymakers, and educational institutions. Key victories include the recognition of ancestral lands through the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, legal protection of sacred forests, and the inclusion of Subanen representatives in advisory councils for environmental and cultural policy. National recognition also strengthened advocacy networks. Subanen leaders participated in conferences, legislative hearings, and national workshops, sharing experiences and strategies with other indigenous groups across the Philippines. Their success stories, combining traditional knowledge with legal and environmental advocacy, became models for other communities seeking recognition and sustainable development solutions. By demonstrating leadership in both cultural and environmental spheres, the Subanen challenged long-standing stereotypes of indigenous passivity, asserting that their contributions are essential to national development, heritage preservation, and ecological sustainability. This recognition also had internal significance. Communities experienced increased pride, confidence, and cohesion, reinforcing intergenerational commitment to cultural preservation and environmental stewardship. Youth were inspired to take active roles in advocacy, education, and governance, knowing that their efforts could yield tangible results. National acknowledgement validated decades of struggle, sacrifice, and strategic advocacy, proving that persistent commitment to ancestral rights and cultural identity could reshape perceptions, policies, and practices across the country. A critical aspect of Subanen progress in this period has been the strengthening of indigenous governance structures. Traditional councils of elders, once informal and localized, have evolved into organized institutions capable of managing complex legal, environmental, and cultural challenges. These councils now coordinate with youth representatives, community organizations, and external advocacy groups to make decisions that are inclusive, transparent, and culturally grounded. Governance reforms include structured decision-making processes, community assemblies, and dispute resolution mechanisms that integrate both customary laws and modern legal frameworks. This ensures that all community members, men, women, and youth, have a voice in key decisions regarding land use, resource management, and cultural preservation. The inclusion of trained youth leaders in governance structures also guarantees continuity and modernization, bridging traditional wisdom with contemporary strategies for advocacy and development. Moreover, Subanen governance increasingly emphasizes collaboration beyond the community. Alliances with local NGOs, environmental agencies, and other indigenous groups allow for coordinated action against land encroachment, environmental degradation, and cultural marginalization. By institutionalizing governance and integrating modern strategies with ancestral traditions, the Subanen have created resilient, adaptable, and forward-looking systems. These structures not only safeguard cultural and environmental heritage, but also position the Subanen as leaders in regional and national efforts to harmonize development, conservation, and indigenous rights. In the 2020s, the Subanen have faced growing challenges due to climate change, including more frequent typhoons, irregular rainfall, prolonged droughts, and shifting agricultural patterns. Recognizing that survival required proactive adaptation, communities implemented a combination of traditional knowledge and modern strategies. Elders taught younger generations to read natural indicators, such as the flowering patterns of native plants, river flow changes, and bird migrations, to predict seasonal shifts, while youth applied scientific techniques like rainfall tracking, soil testing, and flood risk mapping. Villages established community-based early warning systems and disaster preparedness plans, integrating rituals and communal gatherings to strengthen both practical readiness and cultural cohesion. For example, before planting seasons, Elders hold ceremonies to honor the spirits of the land and pray for balance in weather and harvests. These rituals are accompanied by technical planning sessions where planting schedules, crop diversification, and water management strategies are discussed. By blending spirituality with empirical data, the Subanen developed a resilient system capable of navigating climate uncertainties while reinforcing cultural identity. Additionally, intergenerational training became central to adaptation efforts. Youth leaders were mentored in sustainable farming, ecoforestry, and environmental monitoring. They coordinated community patrols to prevent illegal logging, monitor river health, and reforest degraded areas. These proactive measures not only mitigated the impact of climate change, but also empowered communities, reinforcing a sense of agency and unity. The Subanen approach to climate adaptation demonstrates that indigenous knowledge, when combined with modern scientific practices, can provide innovative, culturally grounded solutions to environmental crises. Alongside climate adaptation, the Subanen have actively pursued sustainable livelihood projects to support economic resilience. Agroforestry, community-based farming, and ecotourism have become key sources of income while simultaneously preserving environmental and cultural heritage. Crops are grown alongside native trees to prevent soil erosion and maintain biodiversity, while rivers and forests are protected as sacred and economically valuable resources. Ecocultural tourism has expanded in Subanen communities, inviting visitors to participate in rituals, learn traditional crafts, and experience sustainable agriculture firsthand. Tour guides, often youth leaders trained in both cultural knowledge and environmental science, educate visitors about Subanen history, ecological practices, and ancestral laws. Local crafts, including weaving, beadwork, and herbal products, are sold to support households and fund community projects. This dual approach ensures that economic development does not come at the expense of cultural preservation or environmental sustainability. Small-scale cooperatives and youth-led enterprises have also flourished. Subanen entrepreneurs create products from sustainable forest resources, such as herbal teas, handmade baskets, and traditional clothing, providing income while reinforcing cultural identity. Partnerships with NGOs and government programs offer technical training, access to markets, and microfinance support, allowing communities to scale up initiatives responsibly. Through these strategies, the Subanen achieve both economic empowerment and cultural preservation, demonstrating that livelihoods and heritage are mutually reinforcing rather than conflicting goals. Despite progress in climate adaptation and sustainable livelihoods, the Subanen remain vigilant in advocacy. Ongoing challenges include encroachment by commercial interests, legal disputes over ancestral lands, and broader environmental degradation caused by industrial activity. To address these issues, Subanen leaders continue to engage with local, regional, and national governments, presenting evidence of environmental violations, documenting community impact, and participating in policy consultations. Youth activists play an increasingly prominent role in these efforts. They organize digital campaigns, file petitions, and produce educational content to raise awareness of Subanen rights and environmental responsibilities. These activities often intersect with cultural programs, such as eco-cultural festivals and workshops, to ensure that advocacy is grounded in community identity and supported by broad public engagement. International collaborations also continue, with Subanen representatives attending global indigenous rights and environmental conferences to share best practices and build alliances with other communities facing similar threats. Through persistent advocacy, the Subanen have successfully influenced policy changes, secured legal recognition of ancestral domains, and promoted environmental conservation measures. These efforts highlight a holistic approach to survival and empowerment, integrating traditional wisdom, modern knowledge, sustainable economic practices, and legal advocacy. The Subanen's commitment to protecting their land, culture, and communities illustrates a resilient and forward-looking strategy, ensuring that future generations inherit both the knowledge and resources necessary to thrive in a rapidly changing world. By the mid-2020s, Subanen communities had made remarkable progress in education, blending formal schooling with traditional knowledge to empower the next generation. Community-based schools and programs emphasized bilingual education, teaching both Filipino or English subjects and the Subanen language. These initiatives ensured that children not only master mathematics, science, and literacy, but also retain their cultural identity and connection to ancestral traditions. Elders actively participated in the curriculum, sharing oral histories, rituals, agricultural techniques, and traditional ecological knowledge. Storytelling sessions, conducted in classrooms or community halls, allowed children to learn about ancestral laws, spiritual practices, and moral lessons embedded in folklore. Teachers often combine these lessons with practical exercises, such as monitoring river health, planting indigenous crops, or conducting rituals like the bucklogging contest, demonstrating the real-life applications of cultural knowledge. Higher education also became more accessible to Subanen youth. Scholarships, NGO support, and government programs enabled students to pursue studies in law, environmental science, sustainable agriculture, and cultural preservation. Graduates often return to their communities to serve as educators, advocates, and leaders, bridging the gap between formal knowledge and ancestral wisdom. Education thus became a powerful tool not only for personal development, but also for community empowerment, ensuring that the Subanen remained equipped to address modern challenges while preserving the essence of their heritage. Technology has played an increasingly central role in Subanen efforts to preserve culture, manage resources, and advocate for rights. GPS mapping allows communities to document ancestral lands and sacred sites accurately, providing crucial evidence in legal disputes over territory. Drones and satellite imaging help monitor deforestation, river pollution, and illegal logging, complementing traditional monitoring practices. This integration of modern tools with ancestral knowledge enhances the community's ability to protect both land and heritage effectively. Social media platforms have also become a powerful medium for awareness and advocacy. Subanen youth create educational content, documentaries, and digital storytelling projects that showcase rituals, festivals, and daily life. This content reaches audiences both nationally and internationally, fostering understanding and respect for Subanen culture while highlighting ongoing challenges. Online campaigns and virtual conferences have expanded the reach of advocacy efforts, connecting Subanen communities with NGOs, academic institutions, and other indigenous groups. Digital archiving projects ensure that language, oral histories, music, and ritual practices are preserved for future generations. Audio recordings, video footage, and written transcripts document ancestral knowledge in ways that can withstand the risk of memory loss or displacement. By embracing technology, the Subanen have created a bridge between the past and future, enabling younger generations to access, learn from, and continue the traditions of their ancestors while navigating the modern world. Preservation of ancestral knowledge in the digital era has become a cornerstone of Subanen cultural strategy. Communities digitize oral histories, rituals, traditional songs, and agricultural techniques to ensure continuity. Elders collaborate with youth, educators, and technologists to create multimedia archives that are accessible for learning, research, and advocacy. These digital records serve multiple purposes. They protect knowledge from being lost, provide evidence for legal claims, and educate both Subanen and external audiences about the richness and resilience of the culture. In addition, interactive digital platforms allow the Subanen to engage the younger generation in culturally relevant learning. Mobile applications, online workshops, and virtual reality experiences recreate rituals, sacred spaces, and historical narratives, making cultural education engaging and accessible. Youth are trained not only to preserve these materials, but also to use them creatively in advocacy, tourism, and environmental monitoring projects. By combining digital preservation with community education, technology, and advocacy, the Subanen ensure that ancestral knowledge remains a living, functional part of daily life rather than a static historical artifact. This approach strengthens cultural identity, enhances intergenerational learning, and positions the Subanen as innovators who respect tradition while embracing modern tools for sustainability, visibility, and empowerment. Looking toward the coming decades, the Subanen have articulated a clear and ambitious vision for environmental sustainability. Building on decades of ancestral stewardship, legal advocacy, and community-driven conservation, Subanen communities aim to continue protecting forests, rivers, and biodiversity while adapting to the challenges of climate change. Projects for reforestation, watershed protection, and sustainable agriculture are planned with a long-term perspective, ensuring that resources are preserved for future generations while supporting local livelihoods. The Subanen approach to sustainability combines traditional knowledge with modern science. Elders continue to guide communities in understanding ecological cycles, sacred sites, and indigenous agricultural practices. Meanwhile, Youth and educated leaders apply technology for resource monitoring, climate modeling, and data collection. These integrated efforts allow for predictive planning, anticipating droughts, typhoons, and changes in biodiversity, and ensure that the community can respond proactively rather than reactively. Sustainable farming practices, such as intercropping, organic fertilization, and agroforestry, are paired with sacred rituals that reinforce spiritual connections to the land. This holistic model ensures that environmental protection is deeply rooted in cultural values, creating a resilience that goes beyond policy or legal frameworks. Furthermore, the Subanen aim to expand regional and national collaboration. Partnerships with environmental NGOs, academic institutions, and government agencies strengthen technical capacity, provide funding for long-term projects, and elevate Subanen expertise to the national stage. By combining ancestral knowledge, scientific innovation, and strategic partnerships, the Subanen envision a future where sustainability is not a compromise, but a balanced integration of culture, ecology, and economic development. A blueprint for other indigenous communities facing similar challenges worldwide. Preserving and revitalizing culture remains a central pillar of Subanen strategy for the future. With centuries of oral traditions, rituals, and knowledge at stake, the community has placed strong emphasis on intergenerational learning, digital preservation, and active cultural engagement. Schools, youth programs, and community workshops continue to integrate Subanen language, rituals, crafts, and environmental knowledge into daily education, ensuring that younger generations are deeply connected to their heritage. Digital archives, mobile applications, and online platforms play a crucial role in this effort. Oral histories, ritual performances, medicinal plant knowledge, and traditional agricultural practices are recorded, cataloged, and made accessible for both Subanen youth and external researchers. These tools enable knowledge to survive even in cases of migration or displacement, and allow the community to maintain cultural visibility in national and global contexts. Festivals, eco-cultural tourism, and intergenerational mentorship programs provide tangible, interactive ways for youth and visitors to experience and participate in Subanen traditions. The Subanen also place emphasis on active cultural advocacy. By sharing stories, practices, and historical narratives with broader audiences, the community ensures that its contributions, sacrifices, and generosity are recognized and respected. Maintaining cultural continuity is not merely about preservation. It is an act of empowerment, asserting the Subanen identity as vibrant, dynamic, and central to the social, environmental, and political landscape of the Zamboanga Peninsula. The Subanen approach to leadership in the coming decades is forward-looking, adaptive, and inclusive. Community governance structures have evolved to include elders, youth, and women in decision-making processes, ensuring that wisdom, innovation, and diverse perspectives shape strategy for land protection, cultural preservation, and economic development. By fostering youth leadership and training future advocates, the Subanen prepare to face environmental, political, and social challenges with resilience and strategic insight. Strategic planning includes legal advocacy, environmental monitoring, economic diversification, and cultural programming. Subanen leaders aim to maintain autonomy over ancestral domains while building strong alliances with NGOs, government agencies, and other indigenous groups. Policy engagement is viewed as a long-term investment. Each legal victory, environmental initiative, or cultural program strengthens the foundation for sustainable growth and cultural visibility. Looking forward, the Subanen envision a future where their communities are resilient, culturally vibrant, and ecologically sustainable. They aim to serve as role models for other indigenous groups, demonstrating that it is possible to balance tradition with modernity, spiritual values with scientific knowledge, and local leadership with national and international engagement. The Subanen story, spanning centuries of generosity, struggle, and resilience, continues to evolve, proving that a community deeply rooted in its heritage can navigate change, protect its lands, and lead with wisdom, foresight, and pride. Thank you for joining us on History Teller YT as we explored the extraordinary journey of the Subanen people. Today, you witnessed a story of resilience, generosity, and unyielding commitment to culture and community. From welcoming migrants and sharing ancestral lands, to facing discrimination and overcoming marginalization, the Subanen taught us profound lessons about respect, unity, and the enduring power of heritage. You saw how they revived ancient rituals, integrated technology with tradition, championed sustainable livelihoods, and prepared future generations to continue protecting both culture and the environment. The moral of this story is clear. Respect for others, recognition of history, and the preservation of cultural identity are not just ideals. They're the foundation for peace, community, and sustainable growth. By understanding the struggles and triumphs of the Subanen, we learn that true strength lies in generosity, resilience, and the courage to protect one's heritage while embracing change. Their journey reminds us that societies thrive when ancestral knowledge, community engagement, and forward-looking leadership are honored and applied. We invite you to stay with History Teller YT, where every story we share brings the past to life and provides wisdom for today. Hit subscribe, join our community, and continue exploring the untold histories that shape our world. Each story you hear here is more than history, is a living lesson, a call to reflect, and an inspiration to act with empathy, courage, and respect. Come back for more journeys into the past, where every tale offers insight, every life teaches lessons, and every culture holds the power to change the way we see the world. The Subanen story is just one of many waiting to inspire you. So stay curious, stay respectful, and let the history unfold with History Teller YT.